The primary title, Sluice at Newport docks, did not design itself to process human flesh. But on a damp Tuesday morning, the gears jammed, when the hydraulic arms groaned and seized under the weight of the incoming tide. The maintenance crew assumed it was another waterlogged timber beam or an iron drum from the steelworks. Instead, the winch pulled up a gray mass wedged firmly into the iron slats. It was a man, or what remained after 3 days in the brackish, chemical-heavy currents of the Bristol Channel. The corpse was thoroughly stripped of everything providing a name: no wallet, no papers, and no shoes. The bare feet were raw, bruised by silt, but the ankles bore the distinct indentations of tightly laced industrial boots removed before the plunge. There was no theatrical gore, no dramatic arrangement of limbs. There was only the heavy weight of redundant flesh clogging the infrastructure of a dying port. Gideon De Witt watched the flashing blue lights of the ambulance and the 2 police rovers from the harbor master's auxiliary office, his expression as flat as the gray horizon. As an independent maritime salvage surveyor, De Witt spent his days assessing the financial viability of rotting hulls, rusted cranes, and subsided timber wharves. He was a man built on Anglo-Dutch ancestry, possessing a bureaucratic stillness that made him entirely invisible in the smoke-filled offices of the Port Authority. To the dockers, he was merely the fellow with the clipboard and the yellow oilskin coat who calculated the exact scrap value of obsolete machinery. They did not know that De Witt had recently expanded his professional purview to include the human ledger of the South Wales coast. To his cold, analytical mind, the economic rot of Great Britain in the late 1970s was not a political failure, but a mathematical certainty. The towns were choked with human surplus. Individuals who generated no value clogged the systems of commerce and accelerated the national decline. They were, in the strict vocabulary of his trade, sunken assets requiring immediate extraction. The man currently wedged in the sluice gate had been Arthur Pendleton, a 52-year-old clerk whose professional life was a slow-motion exercise in industrial sabotage. Pendleton was a drunkard who routinely accepted small backhanders, a few quid here, a bottle of cheap scotch there, to falsify the weight manifests of incoming anthracite coal trains. His incompetence created administrative friction, causing delays that cost the shipping lines hundreds of pounds in demurrage fees. De Witt had observed Pendleton for 6 weeks, documenting his erratic movements in a small, grid-lined pocketbook. The clerk's life was an inefficient equation that needed balancing. On the Friday evening prior to the sluice gate failure, De Witt had waited in the shadow of an abandoned salt warehouse behind the Royal Oak, a grim, flat-roofed public house where the local dock workers drowned their anxieties in pints of stale bitter. When Pendleton stumbled out into the freezing Welsh drizzle, reeking of tobacco and low-grade spirits, De Witt was already behind him. There was no exchange of words, no sudden rush of adrenaline. De Witt operated with the clinical detachment of a man decommissioning a rusted boiler. A single calculated blow from a heavy iron marlin spike, a common tool used for separating rope strands in the maritime trade, struck the base of Pendleton's skull, silencing him instantly. De Witt caught the collapsing body before it hit the greasy cobblestones, dragging it into the black interior of the warehouse. He did not mutilate the flesh. He merely systematically stripped the body of its identity. He unlaced the heavy, steel-toed industrial boots, pocketed a brass pocket watch that Pendleton had stolen from his own father, and extracted a soiled leather wallet containing 4-pound notes and a union membership card. The boots were an asset. The watch was a record. Using an old hand winch meant for pulling small skiffs onto the dry dock, De Witt had lowered the dead weight of the clerk into the dark, churning waters of the inner basin. He knew the tides would carry the mass toward the sluices within 72 hours. Back in his terraced house on the outskirts of Newport, where the damp walls smelled of paraffin heaters and boiled cabbage, De Witt opened his iron safe. He did not keep any vulgar trophies of lust or personal anger. He pulled out a black, leather-bound ledger, dipped his fountain pen into iron gall ink, and neatly recorded the entry under the heading of Newport Marine Disposals. He listed Pendleton's age, his estimated weight, the location of extraction, and the items recovered. The 4 crisp banknotes were placed into a rusted biscuit tin for operational expenses. The heavy industrial boots were greased and stored in a crate. The brass watch was wrapped in oilcloth and locked away. An immense balance sheet had begun. The Bristol Channel in the winter of 1980 was a landscape defined by its own aggressive obsolescence. The once thriving coal drops at Berry Island stood rusting in the freezing drizzle, their iron loading chutes looking like the skeletal remains of some colossal extinct beast. Shipping tonnage had plummeted by 40% within half a decade, leaving a graveyard of idle tramp steamers and decaying timber wharves in its wake. The economic heartbeat of South Wales had slowed to an arthritic murmur, stifled by endless union disputes, the influx of cheap foreign steel, and a government seemingly determined to let heavy industry rot on the vine. It was a bleak, unforgiving geography of closed iron gates and striking workers huddled around flaming braziers in the damp, gray mornings. Yet, within this terminal decline, Gideon De Witt found an absolute, comforting order. While politicians in London debated regeneration schemes that would never materialize, De Witt sat in the cold outhouse behind his property, filing the burrs off a pair of heavy-duty bolt cutters with rhythmic, hypnotic precision. His movements were steady, unhurried, and entirely purposeful, reflecting the deep mechanical calm that governed his every waking hour. His domestic life at 44 Keffin Street was a monument to functional austerity. It was a damp, narrow mid-terrace house where the floral wallpaper was permanently peeling in the upper corners due to rising damp, and the faint, perpetual scent of coal dust and paraffin hung heavily in the stagnant air. He owned no television set, relying instead on a battered transistor radio tuned strictly to the shipping forecasts and the local news bulletins. There were no photographs of family, no sentimental trinkets cluttering the mantelpiece, only a meticulously arranged row of maritime reference books, manuals on structural load-bearing limits, and his locked, leather-bound ledgers. The neighbors viewed him as a quiet, solitary bachelor, a bit of a cold fish perhaps, but one who paid his council tax on time and never brought trouble to their door. They had no reason to suspect that the man who meticulously polished his brown brogues every Sunday evening viewed them not as fellow citizens, but as biological variables in a sprawling, failing industrial mechanism. To De Witt, the men and women of the terrace were either productive gears or rusted cogs. There was no middle ground in the brutal mathematics of his worldview. De Witt exhibited none of the chaotic psychological markers typical of the textbook psychopath. He suffered from no grand delusions, heard no disembodied voices commanding him from the shadows, and harbored no sexual sadism or unresolved childhood traumas that the psychiatrists so desperately seek in their clinical evaluations. He simply lacked the fundamental filter of human empathy, replacing it entirely with the ruthless utilitarian logic of a marine scrap merchant. If a cargo crane developed a fatal structural fault, it was dismantled and melted down for the greater good of the dockyard's overall efficiency. De Witt merely applied this identical rationale to the local population. In his view, a society suffering from chronic economic depreciation could not afford the burden of defective human assets. Drunks, corrupt union men, violent debtors, and parasitic middle managers were no different from warped steel girders or rotten timber pilings. They were structural liabilities threatening the integrity of the whole, dragging the balance sheet into the red. They were salvage, awaiting the breaker's yard. The successful disposal of Arthur Pendleton 2 years prior had completely validated his methodology. The local constabulary, the Old Bill, had barely investigated the matter, writing it off as a tragic but highly predictable accident involving a drunk clerk slipping on an icy gangway during a high tide. De Witt had watched the brief inquest from the back of the coroner's court, noting the total lack of forensic curiosity from the attending officers. It confirmed his core hypothesis: the system did not care about the loss of a defective component. The police were underfunded, overworked, and perfectly willing to accept the path of least administrative resistance. As the brutal winter tightened its grip on the Welsh coast, driving unemployment figures higher and filling the local pubs with desperate, angry men nursing cheap pints of bitter, De Witt opened his iron safe. The iron gall ink in his fountain pen flowed smoothly over the crisp, heavy paper of a new ledger page. He was preparing for his next major assessment, methodically outlining the operational parameters of his next extraction. Every entry in the ledger required absolute precision. De Witt abhorred the sloppy, the vague, and the undocumented. Under the heading of Cardiff Sidings Assessment, he noted the prevailing weather conditions, the lunar phase, and the tidal charts, despite the inland nature of the upcoming extraction. To him, the environment was a series of interconnected variables that dictated the success of a salvage operation. He listed the required equipment: a 2-pound ball-peen hammer, a length of heavy-gauge wire hawser, and a canvas drop cloth. The tools were not weapons in his mind. They were instruments of decommissioning. He wiped the tools down with a rag soaked in mineral spirits, ensuring no residual oil or dust could compromise his grip. The preparation was as vital as the act itself. A poorly planned extraction left a messy site, and a messy site invited unwanted bureaucratic interference. De Witt was, above all things, a consummate professional. The new target had been identified weeks earlier during a routine structural survey of the Cardiff railway sidings. It was an environment De Witt knew intimately, a sprawling, unpoliced wasteland of rusted tracks, abandoned coal wagons, and rank weeds coated in a thick layer of industrial soot. He required a location where the noise of the city was swallowed by the sheer scale of the dereliction, a place where the absence of a man would go entirely unnoticed by the authorities for days, if not weeks. He needed a liability that operated completely off the books, someone whose sudden disappearance would be attributed to a hasty flight from creditors rather than foul play. De Witt closed the ledger, the heavy leather cover slapping against the oak desk with a definitive thud. He stood up, buttoned his heavy woolen overcoat, adjusted his flat cap, and walked out into the freezing fog of the estuary. The vast, decaying industrial machinery of the city ground on, blind and indifferent, while the surveyor went quietly to work, carrying a canvas bag of specialized tools meant for dismantling heavy ironwork. The ledger was open, and the accounts required immediate balancing before the new year set in. The metallic screech of the midnight freight hauling anthracite through the Cardiff rail yards was a sound that rattled the fillings in a man's teeth. It was a brutal, deafening, mechanical wail, a noise that swallowed the grinding of the city's heavy industry, the distant two-tone sirens of police rovers, and, highly conveniently, the dense, wet thud of a ball-peen hammer collapsing a human skull. It was February 1981. The deep frost had hardened the mud between the derelict sidings into sharp frozen ridges, and the biting wind blowing off the Bristol Channel carried the bitter taste of sulfur and salt. Amidst this bleak, unlit labyrinth of rusted tracks and stationary coal wagons, Gideon De Witt was conducting his second major extraction. His subject was a 40-year-old unlicensed street bookmaker named Thomas Llewellyn, a man whose entire existence was a corrosive drain on the already impoverished dockland economy. Llewellyn was a permanent fixture in the smoky, dimly lit snugs of the local pubs, a man who survived by skimming the desperate hopes of redundant steelworkers and striking miners. He took bets on the greyhounds, unlicensed, bare-knuckle bouts, and whatever else desperate men were willing to wager their dwindling unemployment benefits on. To the old Bill, Llewellyn was a minor nuisance, a petty crook who occasionally slipped the local beat bobbies a few quid to look the other way. However, to De Witt's rigid utilitarian worldview, Llewellyn was a highly toxic liability. He was a systemic parasite generating zero industrial value, operating entirely off the books, and actively siphoning dosh from the local labor force. More importantly, Llewellyn owed serious money to several violent creditors across the docks. He was a man anticipating a severe beating, making his movements paranoid, erratic, and utterly predictable to a trained surveyor accustomed to calculating stress fractures in failing structures. De Witt had tracked Llewellyn for 3 weeks, noting how the bookie used the abandoned railway sidings as a dark, untraceable shortcut between the betting shops on Butte Street and his squalid lodgings in Grangetown. The ambush was entirely devoid of malice or theatricality. De Witt stood in the deep shadow of a decommissioned brake van, his breathing slow and measured, a heavy canvas dropcloth folded neatly over his left arm. He wore his heavy yellow oilskin coat, not for the rain, but to deflect the freezing wind, and a pair of thick, rubberized industrial gloves. When Llewellyn crunched along the frozen gravel, constantly checking over his shoulder for local enforcers, he did not look up. He never saw the surveyor step out from the rusted ironwork. De Witt waited for the exact moment the midnight freight train roared past on the active upper line, timing his strike perfectly with the deafening clatter of the iron wheels. The 2-pound ball-peen hammer struck the temporal bone with calculated mechanical force. There was no struggle, no desperate plea for mercy. Llewellyn dropped like a severed plumb line, instantly decommissioned. De Witt did not linger over the corpse or marvel at the fragility of human life. He immediately rolled the heavy body onto the canvas dropcloth to prevent any blood from contaminating the frozen gravel, a basic precaution to deny the local constabulary any initial crime scene indicators. Working by the dim, ambient orange glow of the distant street lamps, De Witt systematically stripped the asset. He bypassed Llewellyn's thick wad of betting slips and the loose change in his coat. Instead, he reached into the bookmaker's waistcoat pocket and extracted a heavy silver half-hunter pocket watch. The silver case was tarnished, but it held tangible weight, a perfect artifact for the ledger. Disposal required heavy lifting, but De Witt possessed the wiry, functional strength of a man who spent his life climbing the sheer iron ladders of dry-docked freighters. He dragged the canvas bundle deep into the maze of stationary, condemned coal wagons, rolling stock that had not moved since the coal strikes of the previous decade and was slated to sit rotting for years. He heaved the body over the rusted rim of a wagon, dropping Llewellyn into the deep, black residue of anthracite dust at the bottom. It was an environment that perfectly consumed organic matter. The rats, the freezing rain, and the industrial soot would swiftly break down the remaining physical evidence, leaving the authorities to assume the bookmaker had simply skipped town to avoid his heavy debts. Before dawn broke over the gray waters of the estuary, De Witt was back at his desk in his damp terraced house, the paraffin heater casting a weak, flickering light against the peeling floral wallpaper. The leather-bound ledger lay open. He uncapped his fountain pen and began the necessary administrative work. He logged the date, the location, the exact time of the freight train's passing, and the estimated depreciation value of the bookmaker's removal. The silver half-hunter watch was carefully polished, tagged with a small manila label bearing the date, and locked securely inside the iron safe. The ledger entry was concise, dry, and terrifyingly mundane. There was no guilt, no adrenaline-fueled euphoria. It was simply another line item processed, another structural flaw corrected in the crumbling architecture of South Wales. The suffocating stench of stale ale, damp wool, and cheap roll-up cigarettes hung like a toxic fog inside the taproom of the Black Mariner. It was a miserable Tuesday evening in November 1985, and the local was packed shoulder to shoulder with striking dockers. These were hard, exhausted men nursing half pints of flat bitter, their faces etched with the grim reality of indefinite industrial action. In the corner, surrounded by a sycophantic court of lesser officials, sat Colin Davies. He was a senior union shop steward, a man whose loud voice and aggressive rhetoric masked a deep, fundamental rot. Davies was ostensibly leading the fight against the closure of the deep-water berths, but the reality was far more cynical. He was quietly siphoning off the union's emergency strike fund to pay for his own gambling debts and a newly acquired motor. He was a hypocrite getting fat on the misery of his own men, a structural parasite weakening an already collapsing system. From a small table near the frosted glass window, Gideon De Witt watched him. The surveyor nursed a single glass of stout, remaining entirely invisible amidst the noise and the smoke. De Witt did not care about the politics of the strike, nor did he harbor any ideological sympathy for the dockers. He viewed the industrial dispute merely as a symptom of a failing mechanism, a machine grinding itself down to bare metal. Davies, however, was a specific, identifiable defect. He was actively accelerating the decay, extracting vital dosh from the local economy without generating a single ounce of productivity. In De Witt's rigid utilitarian accounting, Davies was a catastrophic liability that required immediate decommissioning. The decision had been finalized 3 days prior, meticulously recorded in the leather-bound ledger kept locked in the iron safe at Seffin Street. Now, it was purely a matter of execution. The opportunity presented itself shortly past 11 o'clock. The landlord rang the brass bell for last orders, and Davies, flushed with cheap whiskey and his own perceived importance, detached himself from his entourage. He buttoned his expensive camel hair overcoat, a garment glaringly out of place in the Black Mariner, and stepped out into the freezing, rain-lashed night. He did not walk towards the main road to hail a cab. Instead, he took the poorly lit shortcut through the disused eastern wharves. It was a route De Witt had mapped out with a surveyor's absolute precision, calculating the blind spots between the malfunctioning sodium street lamps and the sheer, towering walls of the shuttered port infrastructure. The designated extraction point was the shadow of a colossal, decommissioned concrete grain silo. The structure had been abandoned for half a decade, its loading doors welded shut, the massive iron hoppers rusted into useless immobility. As Davies approached the immense concrete cylinder, his footsteps echoing wetly against the cracked tarmac, De Witt stepped out from the deep recess of a loading bay. There was no hesitation, no theatrical confrontation. De Witt swung a heavy, solid steel spanner, a tool designed for tightening the massive bolts on high-pressure steam valves. It connected with the side of the shop steward's head with a sickening wet crack that was instantly swallowed by the howling wind coming off the estuary. Davies collapsed without a single cry, his camel hair coat instantly soaking up the oily black water pooling on the ground. De Witt knelt beside the body, his face an impassive mask illuminated by the distant, intermittent flash of a lighthouse beam. He worked with the clinical efficiency of a mechanic stripping a ruined engine. He ignored the thick wad of stolen strike funds in Davies's breast pocket. The money was an external variable, irrelevant to the personal ledger. Instead, he gripped the dead man's left hand and forcibly twisted off a heavy, ostentatious gold signet ring from the swollen pinky finger. The ring was Davies's mark of status, a vulgar display of his ill-gotten wealth. To De Witt, it was the perfect artifact, a tangible record of the extraction. He dropped the gold ring into a small suede pouch, pulled the drawstrings tight, and placed it securely inside his yellow oilskin jacket. Disposing of the redundant asset required the utilization of the silo's decaying architecture. De Witt dragged the heavy corpse towards a rusted, ground-level inspection hatch he had discreetly forced open earlier that afternoon. The silo was empty of grain, but the bottom 40 feet were filled with a stagnant, toxic soup of rainwater, rotting pigeon carcasses, and heavy industrial runoff. It was a highly caustic, anaerobic environment that would ensure rapid physical decomposition while completely masking the scent of the rotting flesh. With a final heavy shove, De Witt pushed Davies through the narrow iron hatch. The body hit the black water far below with a heavy, hollow splash, vanishing into the absolute darkness of the concrete abyss. De Witt meticulously resealed the heavy iron hatch, tightening the rusted bolts with his spanner to ensure no casual trespasser could ever prise it open. The rain began to fall harder, washing away the small amount of blood that had pooled on the tarmac. De Witt turned up the collar of his oilskin coat and walked away at a steady, measured pace. He felt no adrenaline, no remorse. The toxic element had been successfully removed from the local ecosystem, the structural integrity marginally preserved. An hour later, sitting in the damp chill of his 7th Street home, the surveyor opened his safe. He logged the extraction of the union official in his neat, microscopic handwriting, noting the weather conditions, the precise location of the silo, and the method of disposal. The gold signet ring was logged, tagged, and placed alongside the brass pocket watch and the heavy industrial boots. The balance sheet of South Wales was slowly, methodically being corrected, one deadweight at a time. The old bill would undoubtedly begin asking questions about the missing union boss, utilizing their local grasses to dig up rumors of bent coppers and rival union factions. But in the chaotic, strike-torn environment of 1985, another vanished man was simply a drop in an ocean of industrial despair, leaving the surveyor entirely free to continue his vital work. The air inside the South Wales Constabulary incident room was a toxic fog of cheap cigars, damp woolen suits, and the tang of carbon ribbon. Detective Inspector Alastair Vance slammed 3 soiled manila folders onto a scarred wooden desk, the sharp thud cutting dead the clatter of manual typewriters. It was October 1986. The room was a monument to administrative fatigue, its walls plastered with curling telex printouts and faded photographs of missing local faces. Vance was a brutal, uncompromising relic of an older policing generation, a man whose liver had absorbed too much cheap scotch and whose lungs were coated in permanent soot. He earned his moniker, the Slate, due to his absolute refusal to use standard police-issue whiteboards. Instead, he carried a framed piece of Welsh slate from the Penryn quarry, stubbornly chalking his timelines and grids by hand. It was an archaic method, but Vance trusted the permanence of stone and the dust of chalk far more than modern bureaucratic ink. He wiped a layer of ash from his gray mustache and began to chalk 3 names onto the slate, the abrasive squeak setting the teeth of the junior detectives on edge. First was Arthur Pendleton, the corrupt clerk pulled from the Newport Sluice gate in '78. The coroner had ruled it an accidental drowning, but Vance had seen photographs of the clerk's feet. The boots had been unlaced, not torn off by the tide. Second was Thomas Llewellyn, the illegal street bookmaker who vanished in '81. The local constables assumed he had fled to London to avoid gambling debts, but Vance knew from his network of local grasses that Llewellyn never purchased a train ticket. Third was Colin Davies, the bent union official who disappeared in '85, supposedly absconding with strike funds. It was a narrative the press loved, but Vance found it flawed. Davies lacked the intelligence to orchestrate a disappearance to the Costa del Sol. 3 deadbeats, 3 local liabilities, 3 men swallowed by the docks. In 1986, the old bill possessed none of the forensic miracles that would sanitize police work in the coming decades. There was no DNA profiling, no mobile triangulation, and no closed-circuit television covering the bleak coastal roads. The investigation of a missing person relied entirely on typewritten files, cross-reference ledgers, and the unreliable testimonies of terrified informants operating in the shadows of the docks. Vance spent his days dragging his worn leather shoes through the bleakest council estates and the most violent public houses in South Wales. He bought pints for retired dockers, threatened low-level fences with the cells, and squeezed every known grass from Butte Street to Barry. He looked for whispers of bent coppers, gangland hits, or a coordinated effort by rival union factions. The streets, however, offered him absolute silence. There was no boastful chatter in the criminal underworld, no sudden influx of stolen dosh hitting betting shops, and no bloody clothing in incinerators. Vance sat alone in the incident room long after the night shift clocked off, staring at the chalk lines connecting the three disparate lives. He began to cross-reference the geography, mapping the last known locations of the victims against the sprawling, rusting footprint of the region's industry. Pendleton died near the Newport docks. Llewellyn's rat run cut through the Cardiff railway sidings. Davies was last seen drinking near the shuttered eastern wharves. The pattern slowly emerged from the dust, cold and undeniable. The killer was not operating in residential neighborhoods or active commercial districts. The hunting ground was strictly limited to decommissioned, condemned, or abandoned industrial properties. The filth were dealing with a ghost who possessed an intimate structural knowledge of the decaying port architecture. It was someone who knew exactly which sluice gates jammed, which rail cars were permanently grounded, and which silos were welded shut. Vance drew a chalk circle around the entire coastal zone. Despite this crucial geographic revelation, the investigation hit an immovable bureaucratic wall. The sheer scale of the dereliction across South Wales was overwhelming. Searching every warehouse, rusted coal drop, and flooded dry dock along the Bristol Channel would require thousands of man-hours and a budget the local constabulary simply did not possess. Vance petitioned his superiors for a task force to search the decommissioned silos near the eastern wharves, but the top brass refused, citing a lack of physical evidence and dismissing his theory as the obsession of an aging copper. The files were quietly designated as cold, manpower reassigned to breaking up union pickets and chasing drug pushers. Vance wiped his slate clean with a damp, dirty rag, the chalk dust turning to a gray paste on his fingers. He locked the 3 manila folders inside his steel filing cabinet, a bitter taste in his mouth. The old bill had the right map, but they were blind to the man walking it. The aggressive, percussive clatter of heavy carriage typewriters, a sound that had defined British policing for half a century, was slowly giving way to the sterile, electronic hum of cathode ray tube monitors. It was 1991, and the South Wales Constabulary was dragging itself into the digital age. The incident rooms smelled less of stale tobacco and wet wool, replaced by the sharp tang of ozone and warm plastic emanating from the new desktop computers. The old guard was being systematically phased out, deemed obsolete in an era that prized data entry over street-level intuition. Detective Inspector Alastair Vance, the Slate, was among the first casualties of this administrative modernization. After 30 years of bleeding for the filth, he retired without fanfare. There was no grand speech, only a lukewarm pint of bitter at a miserable pub near the station and a cheap brass carriage clock from the division. His prized piece of pen-rinsed slate was unceremoniously binned by a young constable the very next morning, and his steel filing cabinet of unsolved local mysteries was relegated to the basement archives. Detective Sergeant Maeve Kowalski inherited Vance's desk, though she represented an entirely different species of investigator. A second-generation Polish-Welsh copper, raised in the brutalist concrete shadows of a Swansea council estate, Kowalski lacked Vance's physical intimidation and network of battered pub grasses. Instead, she possessed a terrifying, almost mechanical capacity for processing bureaucratic minutiae. The local detectives had quickly dubbed her the Sieve. Where older coppers saw an insurmountable mountain of tedious municipal paperwork, Kowalski saw a filter. She could pour thousands of pages of mundane Port Authority logs, shipping manifests, and local council planning applications through her mind, effortlessly catching the single, microscopic grain of anomalous data that everyone else missed. She did not walk the streets looking for whispers. She sat in the artificial glare of the station, hunting for discrepancies in the official records. When the division ordered a mandatory review of unresolved missing persons files to justify their new computerized database, Kowalski pulled the 3 manila folders Vance had locked away half a decade earlier. The South Wales docklands of the early 1990s were undergoing a violent cosmetic metamorphosis. The grim, rusting industrial landscape that had swallowed Arthur Pendleton, Thomas Llewellyn, and Colin Davies was actively being erased. The aggressive economic policies of the previous decade had paved the way for rampant waterfront gentrification. Derelict warehouses were being sandblasted and converted into sterile luxury flats for young executives who wanted a view of the water without the stench of actual maritime labor. Abandoned railway sidings were being torn up for retail parks, and massive concrete grain silos were slated for controlled demolition. This rapid redevelopment presented a critical logistical problem for the police. The historical geography of the region was vanishing. If the killer had indeed utilized the condemned architecture of the port as his personal graveyard, as Vance's old notes vehemently insisted, the evidence was currently being paved over by property developers, pouring thousands of tons of fresh concrete into the estuary. Kowalski spread the aging files across her desk, refusing to be defeated by the changing topography. She reviewed the chalk map Vance had photographed before his retirement, tracing the tight geographical circle he had drawn around the decommissioned coastal zone. Vance had hit a wall because he was looking for a physical man in an impossibly large physical space. Kowalski immediately recognized that this was the wrong approach. The docks were not simply empty spaces. They were highly regulated municipal properties. Even a rotting, abandoned timber wharf possessed a paper trail. It required closure permits, hazard assessments, and regular structural integrity surveys by independent contractors to ensure it did not collapse into the estuary. The killer had operated with total impunity within these highly restricted, hazardous environments. He knew the blind spots, the access points, and the structural limits. That kind of technical knowledge was not possessed by a random local thug or a drunken vagrant off the street. The realization fundamentally shifted the parameters of the investigation. The CIEV stopped looking at the victims, the corrupt clerk, the street bookie, and the bent union boss, and started looking exclusively at the locations. She submitted a massive requisition request to the regional port authorities, demanding every single structural survey, safety assessment, and condemnation order filed between 1978 and 1986 for the designated industrial zones. It was an administrative dragnet of staggering proportions, the kind of tedious, unglamorous police work that never made the evening news. While her colleagues chased joyriders and dealt with the rising tide of amphetamine use on the estates, Kowalski sat in the corner of the humming incident room, surrounded by towering stacks of yellowing, carbon-copied municipal forms. She was no longer looking for a murderer. She was looking for a bureaucrat. She was hunting the man who wrote the reports declaring these sites dead, unknowingly tracking a surveyor who viewed the local population through the exact same clinical, administrative lens. By the spring of 1992, the administrative dragnet had yielded a mountain of paper that threatened to bury the investigation. D.S. Maeve Kowalski lived in a world of carbon copies, municipal stamps, and the dry, precise language of structural engineering reports. She had spent months filtering the redundant paperwork of the regional port authorities, cross-referencing hundreds of safety assessments with the specific dates and locations of Vance's 3 cold cases. It was a monotonous, soul-crushing task. But the sieve did not falter. She was looking for a pattern, not in the blood or the violence, but in the bureaucratic signatures. She needed to identify the independent surveyor who had held the legal authority to sign off on the structural condemnation of the very sites where the bodies had been or would be disposed of. It was a long shot, based on the assumption that the killer's professional life and his personal obsession were inextricably linked. The breakthrough, when it arrived, was as quiet and clinical as the killer himself. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and the station was buzzing with the erratic energy of a new squad briefing. Kowalski was hunched over a stack of archived 1986 closure notices for a series of wharf sidings near the western docks. Her eyes, strained from the relentless glare of the monitor and the dim overhead strip lighting, scanned the bottom of a routine structural survey document. The name leaped out, Gideon De Witt. It was a signature he had used on hundreds of these reports over 2 decades. Kowalski pulled the folder for the 1978 Newport Sluice incident, then the 81 rail siding closure file, and finally the 85 silo report. There, on every single document, was the same precise, angular handwriting. De Witt had been the lead surveyor on every major site designated as structurally compromised at the exact moments the victims vanished. Kowalski did not immediately rush to arrest him. Her training as the sieve had taught her that a desperate rush could destroy a case before it even reached the Crown Court. She needed a link that went beyond mere professional coincidence. She initiated a deep background audit on De Witt, pulling his tax returns, his employment history with the harbor master's office, and his local utility bills. He was a creature of absolute frightening habit. He lived in the same damp terraced house in Seffin Street for 20 years. His council tax was paid by direct debit to the penny, and he had never missed a single working day in the entirety of his career. He was the perfect invisible citizen. However, the audit revealed one glaring anomaly in his 1992 activity logs. De Witt had recently filed a survey report for a grain silo in the Barry area that was scheduled for imminent demolition. The surveyor had listed a routine structural inspection of the silo on a Saturday evening, a time when the port was effectively closed and the site was strictly restricted. Kowalski compared this date with the disappearance of a local diesel smuggler, a man named Marek Vansek, who had been reported missing by his family just 2 days prior. Vansek had been a small-time operator, a man who lived on the margins of the docks and had no shortage of enemies. But his disappearance matched the geographical signature that Vance had identified years ago. The silo in Barry was currently surrounded by high steel fencing and monitored by security patrols for the demolition team. If De Witt had indeed gained access to that site on a Saturday night, he would have had to override the site's own security protocols or possess a valid, updated survey permit to be there after hours. Kowalski retrieved the digital entry for the Barry site. De Witt had logged his inspection into the Port Authority's new computer system at 8 o'clock on that Saturday evening. But the security logs for the silo's main entrance gate showed that no vehicles had entered or exited the perimeter for the entire weekend. The discrepancy was small, almost invisible, but to Kowalski, it was a thunderclap. De Witt had entered the site, but he had done so on foot, via a route that bypassed the main perimeter gates, a route that only someone with his intimate structural knowledge of the decaying port architecture would know. He had not gone there to survey a grain silo. He had gone there to decommission another asset. Kowalski closed her eyes, the dull hum of the computer fans filling the silence. She had him. She had caught the surveyor in his first bureaucratic lie. The balance sheet was finally starting to show the red ink he had been trying to hide for 14 years. She stood up, grabbed her coat, and began to coordinate with the local uniformed sergeant for a discreet, high-level surveillance operation. The quiet, solitary man from Seffin Street was about to find his own ledger suddenly and violently closed by the state. The rain drummed relentlessly against the rusted roof of an unmarked Ford Sierra, parked in the shadow of a derelict ironworks in late 1993. Inside the freezing condensation-slicked cabin, Detective Sergeant Maeve Kowalski wiped a circle on the fogged passenger window with the cuff of her heavy woolen jumper. The vehicle smelled fiercely of damp upholstery, stale tobacco, and the metallic tang of instant coffee kept lukewarm in a battered thermos. This was the unglamorous, grinding reality of a 90s police stakeout, an exercise in sheer physical endurance and aggressive boredom. Kowalski and two plainclothes constables had been rotating through brutal 12-hour shifts for 5 days, their tired eyes fixed on the rusted gates of a commercial diesel depot across the flooded tarmac. They were not waiting for a massive drug shipment or a stolen motor. They were watching Gideon De Witt, a man who possessed the bureaucratic patience of a glacier as he methodically stalked his next human asset. Following the surveyor required the filth to operate with absolute, flawless discipline. De Witt was not a paranoid gangland enforcer checking his rearview mirror for a tail. He moved through the world with the invisible confidence of a municipal employee on official business. He walked at a strictly regulated pace, never jaywalked, and carried a battered leather briefcase that perfectly blended into the drab industrial background of the South Wales docks. If Kowalski's team alerted him to their presence with a sloppy lane change or an exposed radio antenna, De Witt would simply retreat into his fortress of paperwork and disappear forever. Therefore, the surveillance was entirely passive. They logged his movements on paper clipboards, communicating in brief, staccato bursts over a crackling analog radio frequency. They watched as De Witt stood beneath a malfunctioning street lamp for 3 hours in the freezing drizzle, utterly motionless, observing the loading bays of the depot. The target of De Witt's sterile obsession was a small-time black-market diesel smuggler named Bryn Hughes. Hughes was a notorious local liability, a man who siphoned red agricultural diesel from rural farms and sold it untaxed to the independent haulage firms operating out of the port. He was exactly the type of defective component that De Witt's warped ledger demanded be decommissioned. Hughes generated massive structural friction. His contaminated illegal fuel frequently ruined the engines of the heavy goods vehicles, causing logistical delays that rippled across the docks. Moreover, he was a loud, aggressive drunk who frequently brawled in the local pubs, drawing unwanted attention to an already depressed economic zone. Through the magnified lens of her heavy binoculars, Kowalski watched De Witt logging Hughes's chaotic movements into a small, grid-lined notebook. The surveyor was calculating the smuggler's routines, looking for the absolute point of maximum structural vulnerability. The sheer mechanics of De Witt's predatory behavior were chilling in their mundanity. He did not lurk in alleyways clutching a weapon. Instead, he systematically tested the environmental variables of the ironworks. On Tuesday, Kowalski watched him casually inspect the hinges of a heavy steel perimeter gate, verifying that the lock had rusted straight through. On Wednesday, he paced out the distance between the depot's rear exit and an abandoned storm drain, checking his wristwatch to measure the exact duration of the exposure. He treated the impending murder of Hughes exactly as he would the controlled demolition of a condemned timber wharf. He was ensuring that every physical element of the site would facilitate a clean, entirely untraceable extraction. The police Sierra sat in the suffocating darkness, the officers holding their breath as De Witt occasionally turned his head, his flat, lifeless eyes scanning the street. He never noticed the gray Ford. It was simply another piece of rusting scrap in a landscape defined by decay. By Thursday evening, the rhythm of the hunt shifted. The surveyor did not go home after his shift at the Port Authority. He returned to the ironworks carrying a heavy canvas tool bag instead of his usual leather briefcase. The rain intensified, hammering against the flooded tarmac and masking the sound of De Witt forcing the rusted perimeter gate. Kowalski gripped the dashboard, her knuckles white. The constables in the back seat reached for their standard-issue batons, the heavy air in the car suddenly electric with the anticipation of an arrest. But the sieve held up a hand, ordering them to stand down. She knew that arresting De Witt for trespassing on a derelict site would only result in a minor fine. The Crown Prosecution Service needed absolute, irrefutable proof of his lethal intent, and more importantly, they needed the ledger. If they spooked him now, he would destroy his records, and Arthur Pendleton, Thomas Llewellyn, and Colin Davies would remain unavenged ghosts in the estuary mud. Instead of intervening, Kowalski documented the preparation. Through the driving rain, they watched De Witt pry open the heavy iron grating of the deep storm drain. He laid out a thick canvas drop cloth on the slick concrete and carefully placed a heavy steel wrench beside it. He was setting the stage for Hughes, creating a lethal trap that required zero improvisation. Once the site was fully prepared to receive the sunken asset, De Witt simply packed away his notebook, buttoned his yellow oilskin coat against the gale, and walked away into the darkness, leaving the killing floor perfectly arranged. As the taillights of the local bus carried the surveyor back towards 7th Street, Kowalski finally unkeyed her radio. The stakeout had achieved its primary objective. They had established his methodology, confirmed his target, and witnessed his premeditation. It was time to close the trap. She contacted the station house and ordered the uniform division to prepare for a dawn raid. The ledger was finally going to be audited by the old bill. The splintering of a rotten wooden door as the filth executed a dawn raid on a terrace house in Barry instantly shattered the freezing pre-dawn silence. It was 5 o'clock in the morning, and the South Wales Constabulary deployed their heavy entry team to guarantee absolute operational dominance.
Clear!
Tactical officers, clad in heavy riot gear and carrying standard-issue truncheons, poured through the shattered doorframe of Gideon De Witt's property, their boots thundering against the linoleum floor of the narrow hallway. They expected a violent, desperate confrontation, anticipating the chaotic frenzy typical of cornered killers facing a life sentence. Instead, they encountered a scene of profound, chilling domestic banality. The surveyor was not cowering in the shadows, nor did he lunge at the arresting officers with a weapon. De Witt was sitting upright at his Formica kitchen table, fully dressed in beige woolen trousers and a pressed white shirt, methodically eating a bowl of plain porridge. He did not flinch when the front door caved in, nor did his pulse visibly elevate when 3 officers pinned him to the chair and secured his wrists with heavy steel handcuffs. He simply asked, in a flat tone, for the constables to ensure they did not spill his tea. Detective Sergeant Maeve Kowalski entered 2 minutes after the tactical team declared the premises secure. She walked past the splintered wood, her eyes scanning the damp interior of the terrace house. Other detectives were tearing the property apart, searching for the textbook markers of a murderer. They expected deranged scrawlings, a cellar smelling of bleach, or compartments filled with bloody souvenirs. They found absolutely nothing. The house was aggressively sterile, smelling only of carbolic soap, old paper, and paraffin wax. The environment reflected the mind of its occupant, functional, organized, and devoid of human warmth. There were no photographs, no letters, and crucially, not a single microscopic trace of forensic biological evidence. De Witt had never brought his work home. He never allowed the messy reality of death to contaminate his tightly controlled sanctuary. The uniform officers looked confused, wondering if they had kicked down the door of the wrong house, but the sieve remained unfazed. She knew they were not looking for an abattoir. They were looking for a bureaucrat's filing system. Kowalski immediately directed the search team toward the cellar, an area De Witt had fortified with a secondary steel door. It took the tactical unit 20 minutes with an angle grinder to defeat the heavy industrial deadbolts, sending a shower of bright orange sparks into the subterranean air. When the heavy door finally swung open, the officers descended into a small, windowless space illuminated by a single 60-watt bulb. Sitting in the center of the concrete floor was a heavy, fireproof steel safe, the type commonly used by regional bank branches and Port Authority offices. De Witt had silently handed over the heavy brass key when requested, displaying no visible signs of panic. When Kowalski turned the key and pulled the heavy steel handle, the mechanism yielded with a heavy clunk. The investigative weight of the old bill rested entirely on what lay inside. The safe did not contain the gruesome trophies of a psychopath. It contained the immaculate archives of a rogue maritime surveyor. Resting neatly on the metal shelves were 3 thick, black, leather-bound volumes. The spines were unmarked, but the pages within were a devastating catalog of De Witt's lethal arithmetic. Kowalski donned cotton evidence gloves and carefully opened the first volume. The title page simply read, "The Salvage Ledgers." Inside, the pages were filled with De Witt's microscopic, legible iron gall ink handwriting. It was not a diary of madness, but a meticulous balance sheet of murder. Every victim was logged as a decommissioned asset. There was Arthur Pendleton, the corrupt clerk, complete with a calculated depreciation value. Below his entry was Thomas Llewellyn, the street bookmaker, with notes on the tonnage of the coal wagon used for his disposal. And there was Colin Davies, the bent union official, his entry cross-referenced with the exact grid coordinates of the flooded grain silo. The most damning evidence, however, was not the written ink, but the physical artifacts meticulously stored alongside the ledgers. Resting in small velvet pouches, each labeled with a manila tag bearing a reference number, were the stripped assets. Kowalski tipped a tarnished brass pocket watch into her gloved palm. Arthur Pendleton's stolen timepiece. The second pouch contained the heavy silver half-hunter watch belonging to Llewellyn. The third held the ostentatious gold signet ring that De Witt had forcibly twisted off the fingers of Colin Davies. These were not emotional keepsakes. They were the audited receipts of his extractions. The physical proof was absolute, linking the surveyor directly to the vanished men of the estuary. The ledger was fully balanced, the evidence completely unassailable. As Kowalski closed the safe, bagging the ledgers for the crown, she knew the ghost of the Bristol Channel was finally chained to the physical world. The sterile, fluorescent glare of courtroom number 2 at Cardiff Crown Court offered no cinematic drama in the spring of 1994. There was no packed public gallery hanging on every word, no hysterical relatives screaming for vengeance from the viewing gallery, and no sensationalist tabloid circus camped on the courthouse steps. The men Gideon De Witt had decommissioned, a corrupt Weybridge clerk, a parasitic street bookie, and an embezzling union boss, were not the sort of victims who commanded public sympathy or front-page national outrage. They were the grimy detritus of a dead industrial era, and their associates, if they possessed any at all, seemed quietly relieved by their permanent absence. The press benches were half empty, occupied by a few bored regional reporters nursing hangovers and sketching crude caricatures of the trial judge on their yellow legal pads. The atmosphere inside the oak-paneled room was less that of a serial murder trial and more akin to a lengthy, immensely tedious municipal tribunal regarding a disputed commercial zoning ordinance. Gideon De Witt sat in the reinforced glass dock wearing the exact same beige woolen trousers and pressed white shirt he had been arrested in. His posture was rigidly upright, his expression entirely devoid of both remorse and arrogance. His barrister, an expensive, sweat-glistening silk imported from London, attempted the only legally viable maneuver available, an aggressive plea of diminished responsibility by reason of insanity. The defense paraded a costly series of forensic psychiatrists before the jury, men who spoke in dense clinical jargon about profound associative detachment, schizoid personality disorders, and deep-seated psychotic delusions manifesting as bureaucratic obsession. The London barrister passionately argued that a man who treated human beings as rusted machinery, who calculated the depreciation value of a life, must, by strict medical definition, be severely mentally compromised and disconnected from reality. The Crown Prosecution Service, however, required no psychological conjecture. They simply possessed the paperwork. The lead prosecutor did not focus his arguments on the physical violence or attempt to paint De Witt as a monster from the abyss. Instead, he systematically read the salvage ledgers into the official public record. He read the calculated weights, the meticulous cross-referencing of lunar phases and tidal charts, and the precise logging of the stolen brass watches and the heavy gold signet ring. The absolute, unassailable clarity of De Witt's administrative records instantly torpedoed the insanity defense. A madman experiencing a psychotic break does not balance his books to the final penny. A lunatic does not ensure his local council tax is paid by direct debit while simultaneously calculating the exact cubic displacement of a human corpse inside a flooded, sealed concrete grain silo. The prosecutor presented a man who was terrifyingly sane, operating with total intellectual clarity. The defining moment of the trial occurred when the prosecutor accidentally misread the date of Colin Davies's extraction, citing a Tuesday evening instead of a Wednesday. De Witt, who had remained perfectly silent for 2 weeks, calmly leaned toward the microphone in the dock and corrected the barrister, citing the exact page and line number in his leather-bound ledger. It was a display of sheer, unrepentant administrative arrogance that entirely sealed his fate. The jury took less than 3 hours to return a unanimous verdict of guilty on all counts, when the presiding judge handed down 3 consecutive life sentences, explicitly mandating that the surveyor would never again see the outside of a Category A prison. De Witt simply nodded once. He acknowledged the severe sentence with the detached, professional efficiency of a shipping clerk receiving a signed delivery receipt. Sitting in the back row, DS Maeve Kowalski watched De Witt being led down to the holding cells. She did not smile, nor did she celebrate with her colleagues at the local pub later that evening. She simply returned to the station, filed the closed case reports, and moved on to the next stack of missing persons files. By the time the armored prison transport van drove De Witt out of Cardiff, the freezing rain had returned, washing the soot from the crumbling facades of the old city. The South Wales docklands were already accelerating into their new, sterile future. The rusted sluice gates at Newport were being dismantled and sold for scrap metal. The abandoned railway sidings were being buried under thousands of tons of fresh concrete to make way for a sprawling retail park. The deep-water silos in Barry had been completely demolished, the toxic sludge pumped out and replaced by decorative water features for incoming luxury flats. The filth closed their files, the property developers moved in, and the politicians celebrated the urban regeneration. There was no grand victory for good over evil, no profound lesson extracted from the bloodshed. The old industrial landscape had simply absorbed its own surplus, hiding its monsters perfectly within the decay. De Witt was not an aberration. He was merely a man who possessed the audacity to audit a society that was already rotting from the inside out.